That's a Murphy bed behind me.
Oh boy, was Ryan over here before you even met him, World? Ryan may have just been admitting that he has a Murphy bed in the background, but it's hidden for now. In any event, welcome back, World. We're very excited to see you again. I'm Sam Lichtenstein. You've met me before a few times as the Director of Global Security Analyst. I'm super excited to be here with my colleague Ryan. Let him introduce himself before we get started.
Hi, everyone. I'm Ryan Bohl. I'm a senior Middle East North Africa analyst here at Rain, and I cover all kinds of things throughout the Middle East, and in particular, the Gulf Arab states where I used to live as a teacher for about 5 years in the early parts of the 2010s. So that's a specialty area. It's very close to my heart, and I'm always watching events there pretty closely because you're always interested in what happens in places that you used to have a connection with.
Well, and Ryan, I mean, let's be real, coming from the Middle East, it's not like you have to unfortunately strive to find things to keep interested in.
Yeah, usually there's something going on.
Well, and that's a good segue because this is one of those topics that I don't think really has made much news, to be candid, even though it's been going on for years now in the background, this war in Yemen, and all of a sudden we got reports about missiles and drones and things flying towards the UAE. So can you just start us out with the basics here? Like, what is going on?
Right. So, well, let's zoom all the way out. The UAE in 2015 joined the Saudi-led coalition that was intervening in Yemen's civil war. That was a civil war between essentially North and South. It was between the Houthi movement, which is a Shia-derived, I think is the best way to describe it, militant movement that's a rival of Saudi Arabia and an ally of Iran. They want to control Yemen's north and possibly the south if they can. And the UAE and Saudi Arabia went in militarily to try to prevent them from taking over the whole country. And in their nightmare scenario, the Houthis would then openly align with Iran and become basically a Hezbollah on the Red Sea, that they would be a place where Iranian power could fire rockets into Saudi Arabia more or less with impunity. And they really didn't want that to happen. That had been a strategic nightmare for them. And so this intervention...
Ryan, you're already depressing me with that. You don't need to go any further. What, a strategic nightmare on the Red Sea, Hezbollah on the Red Sea? I mean, that's a terrible bumper sticker already.
Right, and it's been a real concern for the Saudis and the Emiratis, so much so that they've put thousands of troops at various times into this civil war, trying to push the Houthis into a place they can better manage them. They never have had the goal to eliminate the Houthis. They've got too much domestic support for that to happen. So really, it's trying to put them into a box that they can handle. Now, as a result of this, a few weeks ago, the Houthis decided to finally bring the war home to the UAE using some ballistic missiles, cruise missiles, drones to strike the capital, Abu Dhabi. And it killed, unfortunately, 3 foreign workers in the industrial zone south of the actual capital. And that was a new paradigm. What it meant is that the Houthis not only could, but would strike the UAE, a place with 90% of the population is foreigner. Many of them are from Europe, from Britain, the United States. It hosts a major U.S. military installation at Al Dhafra. It was a notable escalation. But at the same time, as they've continued to fire rockets and missiles, well, it's mostly missiles, not actually rockets. Rockets wouldn't really reach from Yemen. But the missiles that they've been firing since then have been intercepted by air defenses. And as a result, even though these attacks are ongoing, and this is part of a trend, it kind of explains why it's not getting bigger headlines, because there's not a lot of kinetic action. There's not explosions happening in places that are very public. And most notably, the Houthis have chosen not to go after Dubai yet. And then I think that's intentional. Like they don't want to go after Dubai because they know that that's a more likely place to hit civilians. It's more likely a place to hit some place that people care about. If there was smoke coming out of a tourist site like the Burj Khalifa, all of a sudden the international outrage would kick into overtime, and then the US and Great Britain might become more interested in militarily intervening themselves in Yemen, if even in a limited fashion. And they really don't want that. So at the moment, it's about this awkward choreography of firing a few missiles at the UAE to try to scare people and convince them to leave, to drive away investment. And by hurting the Emirati economy that way, they're hoping they can convince the Emirati government to draw down or even leave Yemen entirely.
All right, so there's a lot to unpack there, but I want to lead with two questions. So the first is you spoke about Iran and the Houthis being somewhat of a pawn for them. What is Iran's role here? I mean, is basically Iran going after the UAE? Are they trying to do something else? How does this relate to the talks in Vienna about the nuclear program? How is this
Mhm.
all connected?
Well, two things can be true at the same time. The first thing that's true is that the Houthis have their own reasons to strike the UAE based on the civil war. So there's a Houthi motive. Now, the Iranians do supply the Houthis with drone technology, technology to upgrade some of their aging Scuds into more capable weapon systems. So they provide them support. And so and then we've also now had a report that at least one of these attacks was carried out from Iraq by a shadowy brigade that is probably linked to the Iranian elite Quds force, their force that they use when they deploy covert action abroad. So there is an Iranian role, but the Iranians seem to be sending a subtle message, so to speak, that is trying
Well,
to.
only so much subtlety when stuff's raining down from the sky, though, to be
Right.
clear.
But of course, the Iranians have the capability to cause a lot more harm than this. And we saw with the way that they leveled things at Abqaiq in Saudi Aramco in 2019, the way that their missiles hit those US bases in Iraq in 2020. If the Iranians wanted to send a really big message, they're more than capable of evading whatever air defenses the Emiratis could throw at them. So they are calculating. They're firing things that can be shot down. They're firing things at locations that are less likely to cause civilian casualties. And I think what the Iranians are trying to do is not only signal to the Emiratis about how much trouble they could really cause, they're also trying to tell the Emiratis that they don't consider them as neutral anymore, especially with normalization with Israel. They're also trying to signal to the Emiratis that if a new nuclear deal does come through, they're expecting that the Emiratis don't lobby against it, don't try to escalate against the Iranians. They're signaling to the Emiratis that they're now in the target line in a really serious way. And the Emiratis need to be a lot less hawkish and a lot less aggressive regionally, especially when it pertains to Iranian interests.
Okay, so how does this at all factor into the talks in Vienna, or does it not? Because it seems to me that Iran, on the one hand, kind of wants to keep up the pressure, but it doesn't want to keep up too much pressure that it, forces everybody away. Am I right in that thinking?
Well, yeah, but there's also this doesn't actually factor too much into the Vienna talks at the moment. It would if one of these bases, the U.S. base at Al Dafra, if that had gotten hit, and apparently it was a target of one of these Houthi strikes, if that was hit and it resulted in American casualties, we could see the Vienna talks getting derailed by something like that. Which is again why these attacks seem to be calculated. They don't want to. They want to achieve an objective, which is to threaten the Emiratis. They don't want to upend what's going on at Vienna because the macros of Vienna do favor some kind of a deal. The United States does not want to escalate militarily against the Iranians. It wants to get them back into some sort of nuclear box, even if it's not as good as what they had in 2015. That's what the U.S. wants, and the Iranians want sanctions relief. So the macros favor both of them cooperating in some level on those Vienna talks. And this other stuff is all about building out this other paradigm of, okay, what does the region look like post nuclear deal? If there is a nuclear deal, what are the proxy zones? Where are there covert actions happening? And now we can expect that the UAE is going to be part of that, a front line in which missile attacks, cruise missile attacks, drones, that's going to be part of their new normal.
All right, so let's get down to brass tacks, and I don't really mean to make light of this, but in all seriousness, I just had a buddy that got back from Dubai. I have another one going in a few weeks. Candidly, that one, if he got a little roughed up, I wouldn't mind, but I certainly don't want him being at Sunday brunch in one of these massive hotels, and you have some drone strike that occurs nearby. I mean, is this like a real risk to tourists in Dubai, which is obviously a huge destination for Americans and others?
Well, so it's pretty difficult to exactly put a number on your personal risk if you're traveling through there. I'll give you my own. Like if I was living out there still at this point, and I was still single, and it was just me, I'd ride it out. I probably would ride it out with given what the current dynamics are, and reassure people back home and be like, I'm still more at risk on the UAE's unbelievably dangerous roads. Like I'm more likely to be driven off the road by a Land Cruiser than I am to be killed by a Houthi missile strike. But I do have kids now. I'm married. That would have changed my risk calculus. And I would have said something like, this isn't worth it. There's too much instability. And even if I'm not going to get hit by a Houthi missile strike, maybe my business, whatever I'm involved with, maybe they decide to leave. Maybe they decide to charge me a higher insurance premium. Do I want my kids growing up in a place where, rocket attacks and missile attacks are a normal thing? I probably would be thinking about exiting as an older, more established person. So it really depends on your personal risk calculation at the moment. But people who live in the country, they have to take this into account now. It is like the latent earthquake risk that exists in that country, which is, it's weird to think about, but the UAE does have earthquakes. It's one of those things you do have to think about now with your personal planning. You need to have an evacuation plan. You need to think about how you would leave the country if things escalated, and you need to think about, similar to a fire drill, where do you go, where do you meet if this sort of situation escalates? And you also have to decide what your own internal risk calculus is. How much is too much for you? And if you're in the country, unfortunately, the Emiratis are taking the hard line to censor media, arrest people who post videos. They don't want this being talked about at all. And that makes it tricky if you're living in country to know what the real risk is. So keeping an eye on international media, checking out news sources that are outside of the Emirates and seeing what's really happening. And if you can, listening to experts who are talking about what's happening in Yemen and with Iran, so that you can figure out, okay, this is getting worse. Maybe I don't want to stick around for this, or maybe it's getting better, or it's staying the same. And I can ride this out.
All right. Well, I mean, I hate to say it, but you set me up perfectly there. We have our own experts like you, Ryan, and our team at Root. And for the world to know, you're always welcome to please check out our website, our other social media feeds, our Facebook Lives, all the other media that we're doing to try to share this expertise and provide this warning. Because what you just told us, Ryan, even if not likely to impact that many people significantly, is quite a sea change in kind of impression of what we think of the UAE as this real kind of beacon of stability in an otherwise tumultuous region. Clearly, there's a lot of stuff that we all need to be at least considering, even if it doesn't immediately change our calculations.
Right, exactly. And it just, yeah, the more you can know, the better informed you can be. And if you're thinking about things like long-term investments, things like that, that also gets a little trickier with this. But places like Riyadh have been experiencing these attacks for years. It hasn't upended life, and the Houthis don't have the capability to rain like a blitz style attack on Dubai. So there is some reassurance that this can't escalate to a level of smoking skylines everywhere from the Houthi angle. But if Iran is interested in escalating against the UAE, if they see them as an Israeli proxy or an Israeli ally, and Israel decides to escalate against the Iranians, then UAE is in the target line. And that's just something that has to be in the back of your mind if you're considering working, living, or traveling in the UAE.
All right. Well, I'm certainly going to be considering alternative spring break destinations, maybe some very isolated Caribbean island. Uh, but until then, thanks everybody for checking us out. And we'll be back next week with some more great experts to talk about global events.